it's a very great pleasure to be here today on this really exciting day for Daphne in Daphne's journey. Now, I'm hoping that some slides will appear. Let me just, there we go. Great. I'm very exciting to be here. This is, I think, a really pivotal time in the sense of both the opportunities and the challenges that we face in national infrastructure broadly and in relation to analysis of national infrastructure. I mean, from the analytical perspective, we're all aware of this abundance of data and compute, and yet, as I'll touch on in this talk, I think we're facing really profound challenges for whether what we're actually able to do matches up with those expectations. And then for infrastructure itself, there are big challenges coming up in relation to whether the ambition, in particular in relation to decarbonisation and net zero, is consistent with the challenges of affordability and the cost of living, as well as the uncertainties in terms of how infrastructure is being used post-COVID. So in this talk, I'm going to touch on some of those issues, both the issues facing infrastructure, how we go about modelling those systems, the role of Daphne, and some thoughts about the future. What's going on with infrastructure? I'll start with the global picture. And globally, we're seeing this both enormous volume, staggering volume of investment in infrastructure, and also staggering volume of need. You possibly can't see this here, but you can see some of the big numbers across the top. Investment need, 94 trillion. I'm old enough to remember the presidency of Ronald Reagan, and there's I'm not sure whether this is true or not, but there was at one point his Treasury Secretary was talking to him about the state of the national debt, and Ronald said, a trillion here, a trillion there, pretty soon we're talking big money. And this is the situation we're facing in relation to infrastructure investment. To dig into that, these are just an example, some results from one of my doctoral students, Jasper Verschoor, who over the last few years has been looking at the future of international shipping, freight trade, and has used OECD scenarios for trade, and then downscaled that to every port and every shipping route globally. And here we're looking at scenarios for the growth in freight throughput of ports in billions of tons, the area requirement at ports in thousands of square kilometers, and these are for different shared socioeconomic pathways. Many of you will know what that means, different climate change pathways. So this is higher growth and higher climate change, whether these are more integrated or fragmented global trade systems. And that is broken down, as you can see, according to areas of container port, dry bulk, general cargo, ro-ro, liquid bulk. And so the next step, we've translated that into investment needs. So we go for different types of port from new port area in order to accommodate all of that trade, and then the investment need, again, in trillions. The numbers are absolutely vast. And in here, we're now looking at what those numbers amount to in terms of percentage of the current GDP of the countries in which those ports are located, low income, low middle income, upper middle income, and high income. And so in low income ports, in particular low income ports in Africa, we're seeing potentially need for investment in port infrastructure, which is you can see 3, 4, 5% of countries' current GDP in order to accommodate that amount of global trade and development. So that just gives some sense of the scale of the drivers. The other driver, of course, is how we do all of these things in a way which is consistent with the Paris Agreement and net zero. These types of pictures will be familiar to you in terms of where current policies and actions will get us, what the agreed 2030 targets will get us, what the pledges and targets agreed at Glasgow will get us, and then possibly the most optimistic scenario. And we know the way in which those targets ripple right the way through infrastructure, through the energy system with a massive transition to renewables and storage, and action on the demand side, through the transport system, and through every other sector. And just one glimpse of this, we're doing some work actually on decarbonisation of shipping and the role of ammonia as which is created from green hydrogen. And this is one of actually the largest green hydrogen and ammonia facility in the world, which is proposed at the moment in Western Australia. A 2 point, what's this? It's a bit blurred. I think it's 2 point something, possibly 2.8 gigawatts solar farm in Western Australia, all for green hydrogen. To put that into proportion, Hinkley C is 3.2 gigawatts, so we've got almost the country's largest nuclear reactor in solar being used to create green hydrogen and hence ammonia, which will be used to decarbonise the shipping fleet. Just one kind of striking example of the scale of investment that is being talked about. And then the other dimension of the future, which is where a lot of my work is focused, is then how one makes that transition resilient. So what will be the impacts of climate change on all of that new infrastructure, and how can we prioritize in order to invest in resilience in the right places at the right time. And again, I've got some snippets from a couple of reports, one from the Global Commission on Adaptation, Adapt Now, the other very good report by the World Bank called Lifelines, the Resilient Infrastructure Opportunity. And both of these reports have come up with more or less fact-based numbers on the benefits of resilience. The World Bank says a benefit-cost ratio of 4 to 1. The Global Commission on Adaptation said between 2 to 1 and 10 to 1. I mean, all of those numbers need to be taken with a pinch of salt, because what the economic benefit of resilience depends absolutely on what you do. Development banks, donors, say the World Bank, for example, has said they're going to aim to 50-50, 50 investment in adaptation, 50% investment in mitigation. But what worries me about that is that the adaptation side of things, it's very, very easy to waste that money, to invest in the wrong adaptation projects and not get the returns which apparently are available according to the World Bank and others. So that's some big pictures from around the world. Let's just zoom in to the infrastructure challenges in this country, and where the National Infrastructure Commission, which I've just joined as a commissioner, is gearing up for the second National Infrastructure Assessment. And in preparation for that, last year the NIC published this baseline report which set out the Commission's thinking about what the issues are for the future. And the headlines here from the executive summary is, since the first assessment, there's been progress on some issues: fibre rollout, electricity decarbonisation, resilience, infrastructure financing. And then it says, however, in other areas, there's more to be done. greenhouse gas emissions from economic infrastructure need to reduce further. We know that. Asset maintenance issues undermine the performance in some sectors, and the use of technology for asset management and predictive maintenance is something I'll come to in a moment. More than 3 million properties in England are at risk from surface water flooding, and how we go about analysing that risk and prioritising interventions is a challenge which, as far as I'm concerned, has not yet been solved, though there are some ideas in the room. Serious pollution incidents from water and sewage are unacceptably high, very much in the public mind at the moment, as we know. Urban transport connectivity varies and is poor in many places. So that gives a set of pretty big issues that need to be addressed. And then it goes on, future trends and government commitments will bring new challenges. Climate change will make it harder to make and keep infrastructure resilient. I think that's absolutely true. Nature is declining at unprecedented rates. The COVID-19 pandemic may lead to long-term changes in where, and I would say how, people live and work. And new and emerging technologies will offer opportunities across sectors, and it's those opportunities that we're really here to talk about in the context of DAFNI. So where the National Infrastructure Assessment is going is depicted in this diagram. There's a series of activities around reaching net zero, with a particular focus on heat, because heat, as we know, is the area where there's been less progress in terms of decarbonisation, but also continued active action on decarbonising electricity generation, and a particular new focus on regional approaches to hydrogen and CCS. On the other side, there's climate resilience. Surface water flooding, as I've mentioned, is a priority. Asset management for resilience, and there's going to be some further work on waste and the circular economy. And down here there is supporting levelling up, which is where in particular the transport activity, both interurban and intra-urban transport, comes into the picture, which kind of takes us to the very difficult question of what role infrastructure should and can have in levelling up. This is a front cover from the Economist a couple of years ago now, which examined the multiple issues facing disadvantaged parts of the United States and Europe, and examined, amongst other things, to what extent can infrastructure make a contribution to economic recovery and regeneration in those places? And the answer is it's not at all obvious. Increased connectivity clearly makes a difference in places where there are accessibility constraints to places that have the benefits of agglomeration. So cities that are growing, including this one, as well as Leeds across the Pennine, London, of course. Where one can release those constraints, then investing in accessibility is a pretty good bet. But in places which, with less growth potential, the combinations of interventions that are needed, so we're talking now about kind of programmatic interventions. Just doing transport is unlikely to be the solution. It involves investments in job opportunities, homes, education, skills, and so on. And so I think we need to be a bit humble about the role of infrastructure, and certainly open to learning more, indeed experimenting in terms of what effect infrastructure can have in levelling up. And then the other kind of big wild card as we think about the next National Infrastructure Assessment is what is happening to mobility post-COVID. So these are TfL taps on mostly this is London Underground, and we can see the dramatic effect of COVID-19, things kind of coming up and down with different waves of COVID, and the situation going through until January 2022 there. And so what happens with mobility is there's a whole load of discussion about, as you'll all be aware. There are interesting facts out there in terms of the rebound of leisure transport being much more vigorous than the rebound of work-related commuting. And I think, to be honest, we just don't know. I'd be interested in what other people in the room have to think about this, but it does make commitments around investment in accessibility at a fiscally constrained time much more difficult bets to place. So at the end of the NIA baseline report, it said delivering on these challenges will require bold action, stable plans, and long-term funding. And I think between the lines, though it wasn't actually written in these words, these are my words, is some difficult choices. And those choices in particular now relate to the fiscal situation and questions of cost of living and affordability, which has really gone up in the mind of regulators across the country. So what's the role of modelling and analytics in all of those questions? And I tend to put this in kind of 3 timescale categories. Oh no, but before we get to those 3 timescale categories, sorry, the well-known Richard Feynman quote, what I can't create, I don't understand. So I think the first point to make about modelling and analytics is a kind of one which is when you get it, you kind of end up taking it for granted, is that by modelling systems, we understand them. And modelling has become so much part of the kind of epistemology of how we think about infrastructure systems, it is more or less taken for granted. No one would, for example, plan a big investment in a water resource system, a new reservoir in this country, without analysing it with a model. And yet we don't kind of necessarily think about how much we learn by going through that modelling exercise. And having just coming to the end, we'll hear later on this morning from Johnny Wilson about analysis which has been going on for the rapid analysis of major strategic infrastructure options for the water resources. And I would say that as much has been gained from that analysis by developing shared understanding of the systems as has been gained by evaluating different options and comparing them with one another and coming up with a robust solution. So what we get from this, and these are the 3 timescales. The first one is the real-time forecasting and control timescale. This is where we think most about the role of digital twins. And it's an area where I think the potential is such a long way from what we've actually managed to achieve in reality so far. This picture here is a depiction of the role of smart demand-side response in the electricity sector. So the notion that real-time control can operate devices and appliances, including your electric vehicle charging, and can respond to market signals, electricity price signals in an optimal way. That is so far from the device which was just installed in my house, which was apparently called a smart meter. The second kind of timescale we're thinking about here is in relation to asset management, predictive maintenance, and using the data on assets, which is increasingly at our disposal, to make those choices much better and anticipate problems and intervene in systems in a much more efficient way so that we're getting value for money out of infrastructure assets. And the third time scale, which is the one I work on most, is the long-term planning problem. So looking at the trade-offs between different infrastructure investments and policies in order to come up with strategic and sometimes adaptive plans. And this picture here comes actually from Thames Water's draft water resource management plan for 2019, which I think is a very nice depiction of lowest cost, least environmental effect, most able to cope with future challenges. So that's relating to population growth, amongst other things. So the three axes of the trilemma, affordability, environmental impact, security of supply, and these are showing different strategic options, the size of those options and where they happen in the future. And it gives some sense of the trade-offs between them, and then what some form of compromise sustainable scenario might look like. So there's a real potential for analytical tools in that space, and as I say, we'll be hearing more about the RAPID project later on this afternoon. Just a few words then about the role of Daphne in all of this. I think the attractions are easy to write down. They've been quite hard won. And it's only when you do it that you recognize the benefits of it. The first is having curated models and data sets in an accessible and reproducible way. And reproducible because those things are plugged together into workflows, which means that the analytical process is transparent and reproducible. There's a lot of compute in Daphne, thanks to the funding we've had from UCRIC. There's a lot of hardware there, and so that means that once you've created a workflow, you can run it and make the most of the compute. And there's visualization tools at the other end, so you can scrutinize and learn from what's been done. And I think what we've learned also, including via the RAPID project and other projects, OpenClim as well, is the way in which Daphne serves a purpose as somehow being an interface space between researchers and practitioners, and making models and analysis more accessible in ways that people can actually use it more conveniently than could otherwise have been done if a model was sat in a university, and more reliably and with more confidence of that the model is going to continue to be accessible and curated, and also with some confidence around security and licensing and other issues which are extremely important. So just a few words about the future, and looking back on this, I don't think any of this is going to be particularly surprising to people in this room, but I think it still needs to be said. One is, this is an arms race in the sense that the number of things that are coming out, the number of data sets, spatial data sets in particular, that are coming out is incredibly exciting, but it's very, very dynamic. There's a real sense that there's a wave which one has to stay on the crest of at the moment. And then on top of that, data wave is what can be done with respect to machine learning to actually extract insights at a scale and using a number of variables which would otherwise have been infeasible. And then using that, as I say, on this range of different timescales, from the real time through to the medium term, through to the long-term planning. And there's a, excuse me, logo there from a project we just started with the IMF, using this real-time ship movement data, AIS data, some of you may be familiar with it, to provide real-time warning to the IMF in relation to trade shocks which are happening potentially around the world, so that they have that real-time data to make more targeted and more timely decisions. And then finally, within this data revolution is the role of crowdsourcing, and I think in particular in relation to infrastructure asset condition, infrastructure performance and usage. There's lots more potential there than we've actually been able to exploit so far, though there have also been a lot of very exciting experiments, including by people in the room here, in terms of making the most of that. So where does that take us? To a framework where we're really quite heterogeneous in terms of the multiple data sources, either directly from sensors, from crowdsourcing, from external simulation models, from external databases, which interfaces with these layers of system of systems analysis, resides on compute, Daphne compute or cloud compute. The two are basically equivalent to do all of the things, both database, the machine learning, the data assimilation, but also the physically based simulation modeling. And then coupled there with accessible visualizations to inform decisions and learn from the data for a variety of use cases, both in the public domain and in the private domain, which one interacts with dynamically in terms of putting back in the decision variables for scenarios and stress tests and interventions in order to understand how, by intervening, system performance can be modified and improved in the future. So I hope that sets the scene for today. And as I've said, I think we're what often feels like quite a breathtaking place at the moment in terms of the speed of innovation, the number of opportunities, in particular in relation to data, that are coming our way, but also the amount of innovation that's taking place, not just in this room, but in many other places around the world, and frankly, the pace of competition. That's all very exciting, but I think we also face some persistent issues which seem to come up time and time again, and Daphne was designed to be a version of a solution to some of these issues. The questions of data and model integration, we're going to hear about OpenClim, and that's a kind of really classic example of taking a whole bunch of different formats of climate data in that context, a whole range of different climate impacts models, flooding models, water resource system models, heat, agriculture, you name it, in order to come up with consistent metrics of risk and the way in which those risks are going to change in the future, and also to test adaptation options. And that there are so many different versions of that integration problem, and still I find it's too difficult whenever one encounters a new version of it. The next layer on top of that is not only as soon as you've kind of solved that tricky integration problem, the agenda has changed. And I kind of feel this on the National Infrastructure Commission, and in terms of previously our interactions with the NIC in relation to the development and use of NISMOD, was designed with a particular view of the world, a particular set of challenges in mind, and in many senses those challenges persist, in particular in relation to decarbonisation and adaptation. But on the other hand, the world moves on in shocking and surprising ways, and the combination of first COVID and now the war in Ukraine and the effect on energy prices are just kind of two instances of that. The agenda is changing very rapidly, and yet I find that our modelling capabilities are still not agile enough to respond to that rapidly changing agenda. And yet that rapidly changing agenda points ever more to the urgency of responding to the climate emergency, of making difficult choices about future infrastructure needs in the face of a cost of living and a very tight fiscal situation. So the need for solutions is greater than ever. The challenge is for the people in this room to come up with them. Thank you.